To assess a company's future earnings and also evaluate its current period's earnings, it is helpful to separate those prior year items of income and expense that are likely to continue in the future from those items that are less likely to continue in the future. Some items from prior years are clearly not expected to continue in the future periods and are separately disclosed on a company's income statement as discontinued operations. When a company disposes or establishes a plan to dispose of one of its component operations and will have no further involvement in the operation, the income statement reports separately the effect of this disposal as a discontinued operation under both IFRS and the US GAAP. Financial standards provide various criteria for reporting the effect separately, which are generally that the discontinued component must be separable both physically and operationally. Because the discontinued operation will no longer provide earnings or cash flow to the company, an analyst can eliminate discontinued operations in formulating expectations about a company's future financial performance. Earlier, we saw the Procter & Gamble's income statement, which showed some amounts of income related to discontinued operations in 2010 and 2009, and the footnote explained that these amounts related to 2009 divestitures of its global pharmaceutical business and the 2008 divestitures of its Floggers coffee business. Category of extraordinary items is not permitted under IFRS and must be reported separately from continuing operations under US GAAP. Under US GAAP, an extraordinary item is one that is both unusual in nature and infrequent in occurrence. Extraordinary items are presented separately on the income statement and allow a reader of the statement to see that these items are not part of a company's operating activities and are not expected to occur on an ongoing basis. Extraordinary items are shown net of tax and appear on the income statement below discontinued operations. Given the requirements for classification of an item as extraordinary, both unusual and infrequent, an analyst can generally eliminate extraordinary items from expectation about a company's future financial performance. For other items on a company's income statement, such as unusual items, accounting changes, and non-operating income, the likelihood of them continuing in the future is somewhat less clear and requires the analyst to make some judgments. IFRS requires that items of income or expense that are material and are relevant to the understanding of the entity's financial performance should be disclosed separately. Both unusual or infrequent items are likely to meet these criteria. Under the US GAAP, which allow items to be shown as extraordinary, items that are unusual or infrequent but not both cannot be shown as extraordinary. Items that are unusual or infrequent are shown as part of a company's continuing operations under US GAAP. For example, restructuring charges such as costs to close plants and employee termination costs are considered part of a company's ordinary activities. As another example, gains and losses arising when a company sells an asset are part of a business for more or less than its carrying value are also disclosed separately on the income statement. Highlighting the unusual or infrequent nature of these items assists an analyst in judging the likelihood that such items will reoccur. At times, standard setters issue new standards that require companies to change accounting policies. Companies may be permitted to adopt to standards prospectively, that is in the future, or retrospectively, that is restate financial statements as though the standards existed in the past. In other cases, changes in accounting policies, for example, from one acceptable inventory costing method to another, are made for other reasons such as providing a better reflection of the company's performance. Changes in accounting policies are reported through retrospective application unless it is impractical to do so. Retrospective application means that the financial statements for all fiscal years shown in a company's financial report are presented as if the newly adopted accounting principle had been used throughout the entire period. Companies sometimes make changes in accounting estimates, such as the useful life of a depreciable assets. Changes in accounting estimates are handled prospectively, with the changes affecting the financial statements for the period of change and future periods. No adjustments are made in such cases to prior statements, and the adjustment is not shown on the face of the income statement. Significant changes should be disclosed in the notes to financial statements. Another possible adjustment is a correction for an error for a prior period, for example in financial statements issued for an earlier year. This cannot be handled by simply adjusting the current period income statement. Correction of an error for a prior period is handled by restating the financial statements, including the balance sheet, statements of owner equity, and cash flow statement for the prior periods presented in the current financial statement. No disclosures are required regarding the error. These disclosures should be examined carefully because they may reveal weaknesses in the company's accounting systems and financial controls. Perhaps the most important accounting metric for an analyst is the earning per share. Earning per share or EPS is presented on the face of the income statement, both basic and diluted, and it is calculated as the net income available to common shareholders divided by the total weighted number of shares outstanding during the accounting period. When a company has issued any financial instruments that are potentially convertible into common stocks, it is said to have a complex capital structure. Examples of financial instruments that are potentially dilutive and convertible into common stock include convertible bonds, convertible preferred stock, employee stock options, and warrants. And a warrant is a call option typically attached to securities issued by a company such as bonds. They are like sweeteners to make the bonds attractive to the buyers. A warrant gives the holder the right to buy the shares of the company at a specified price within a specified time period. If the company's capital structure does not include such potentially convertible financial instrument, it is considered to have a simple capital structure. The distinction between simple versus complex capital structure is relevant for the calculation of EPS, because financial instruments that are potentially convertible into common stock could, as a result of the conversion or exercise, potentially dilute, that is, decrease the earning per share. Information about such a potential dilution is valuable to a company's current and potential shareholders. Therefore, accounting standards require companies to disclose what their EPS would be if all dilutive financial instruments were converted into common stock. The EPS that would result if all dilutive financial instruments were converted is called diluted EPS. Basic EPS, on the other hand, is just calculated using reported earnings available to common shareholders and the weighted average number of shares outstanding. However, companies are required to report both basic and diluted EPS. In example 1 of calculating EPS, we have the basic EPS formula given on the slide, which is the net income minus preferred dividends divided by the weighted average number of shares outstanding. If we deduct preferred dividends from net income, it results in net income available to common shareholders, and that when divided by the weighted average number of shares outstanding gives us the basic EPS. Now the weighted average number of shares is the time weighted average of the common shares outstanding, and we will learn how to calculate that next. Let's assume that a company had a net income of 2.431 billion for the year. There are 488.3 million weighted average number of shares outstanding. There is no preferred stock issued by the company. There are no convertible stocks, options, and warrants. So what is the company's basic EPS? Using the formula from the previous slide, we will deduct any preferred dividends from net income and in this case we don't have any preferred dividends, so 2.431 billion minus 0 divided by the weighted average number of shares, which are 488.3 million. The basic EPS in this case is equal to $4.98. In example 2, we are learning how to calculate the weighted average number of shares. The requirement is, first we have to calculate the weighted average number of shares outstanding, and then we have to calculate the company's basic EPS. We are assuming that a company had net income of $2.5 million and paid preferred dividends of $200,000. On January 1st, it had 1 million shares outstanding. Then additionally, it issued 200,000 shares on 1st of April. And on 1st October, it purchased 100,000 shares, that is bought back 100,000 shares from the market. So the number of shares outstanding on 31st December are 1.1 million. First, we calculate the weighted average number of shares outstanding. To do this, first we calculate the weighted number of shares that were outstanding during the year from January to March, that is 1 million shares for 3 months. So we have 1 million multiplied into 3 over 12, that is 1 million multiplied into 0.25, which gives us 250,000. Then from 1st April to October, there were 1.2 million shares outstanding because 200,000 shares were issued on 1st of April. So we have 1.2 million shares outstanding for 6 months. That is 1.2 million multiplied into 0.5. That gives us 600,000 shares. Then in October, we are buying back 100,000 shares. So from October to November, there are only 3 months. So 1.1 million shares for 3 months. So that gives us 1.1 million multiplied into 3 over 12. That is 1.1 million multiplied into 0.25. That gives us 275,000 shares for the 3 months. And if we add them up, we get 1.125 million shares outstanding. That is the weighted average shares outstanding during the year. Note that from 1st April to 1st October there are 6 months. So you should not say that it is 7 months because it is from 1st of April to 1st of October. Now to calculate the basic EPS, we simply deduct the preferred dividends from the net income and divide it by the number of shares that have now been calculated as the weighted average shares outstanding during the year. This gives us basic EPS of $2.04. In this example here, we will learn how to calculate diluted EPS given that we have convertible preferred stock outstanding. We assume that the net income of the company is $1.75 million. The weighted average number of common shares outstanding during the period are 500,000. There are 20,000 convertible preferred shares outstanding also. There are no other potentially dilutive securities. Each share of preferred pays a dividend of $10 per share, and each is convertible into 5 shares of the company's common stock. Calculate the company's basic and diluted EPS. We know that basic EPS is equal to net income minus preferred dividend divided by the weighted average number of shares. The formula for the diluted EPS is net income divided by the average number of shares outstanding plus new shares issued at conversion. Here you see we are not adjusting for preferred dividend anymore, because in this case we are assuming that if the preferred shares are converted into common shares, in that case there will be no dividend paid on the preferred shares. So we don't adjust here net income for preferred dividend when we are calculating the diluted EPS in this case. Calculate the basic EPS. We start with net income of 1.75 million and we deduct from it the preferred dividend, which is 200,000. This gives us the net income available to common shareholders, and that we divide by the weighted average number of shares, which is 500,000, to get the EPS of $3.1 per share. In the case of diluted EPS using the if converted method, we don't deduct the preferred dividend from the net income because we are assuming that if the preferred stocks are converted into common shares, we will have to pay no preferred dividend. So there is no preferred dividend deducted here and it is assumed to be zero. So we will have the same 1.75 million net income as our numerator for the diluted EPS calculation. The weighted average number of shares outstanding is 500,000 and each preferred share is convertible into 5 common shares. So if 20,000 of the preferred shares are converted into common, it will result in the company issuing 100,000 common shares to the preferred shareholders if preferred stocks are converted. This means that to calculate the diluted EPS, we will have to adjust the denominator, that is the weighted average number of shares, and add to it the 100,000 shares if the preferred stocks are converted into common. The result is we have 600,000 shares as denominator. If we divide the net income here by the denominator, that is the weighted average number of shares plus the 100,000 new shares issued in case preferred stock is converted, we get EPS equal to 2.92, and that is diluted from the previous basic EPS of $3.1, and the dilution is $0.18 per share. In example 4, we are using the if converted method for convertible debt and see how to calculate the diluted EPS in that case. We are assuming that the net income available is $750,000. The weighted average number of shares outstanding are 690,000 shares of common stock. Convertible bonds outstanding are total in par value of $50,000 and they pay interest at 6%, and all of these convertible bonds are convertible into 10,000 shares in total. There are no other potentially dilutive securities and the effective tax rate is 30%. We have to calculate the company's basic and diluted EPS. Again, in this case, we will see that our basic EPS formula will remain the same. However, our diluted EPS formula will change because this time we don't have preferred shares but we have convertible debt, and on convertible debt we pay interest as an expense. So we will have to add back the after-tax interest on convertible debt because interest is a tax deductible expense. So only the amount that is after tax will be added back to the net income, because the debt when converted into common shares will not be requiring the payment of interest, and that will increase net income. However, because we have to pay taxes on income, therefore we will not add up the before tax interest expense but after tax interest expense. So we will add this up. In case we have any preferred dividend, we will deduct it from the net income to get the adjusted income and then divide that by the weighted average number of shares outstanding plus the additional common shares that would have been issued if the convertible bonds have been converted in common shares. Again, if we want to calculate the basic EPS in this case, we will start with net income and we will adjust it for preferred dividends, which in this case we don't have any. So the net income available to common shareholders will be the same as net income earlier. So 750,000 is the numerator, that is the net income available to common shareholders. This will be divided by the weighted average number of shares, which is 690,000. That gives us $1.09 as basic EPS. In the case of diluted EPS, we will add back the after-tax cost of interest to net income because the debt, if converted into common shares, will not require the payment of interest. Now, the par value of debt as given is $50,000, and on $50,000 we are paying 6%, which means total interest expenses is $3,000. However, the tax rate is 30%, so we will only be adding net income by the amount of the after-tax cost of interest. So we will multiply this by 1 minus 30%, that is 70%, and we get 2100 as the after-tax cost of debt. This results in the adjusted income to be equal to 752,100. Now the weighted average number of shares outstanding are 690,000, and we know that the debt can be converted into 10,000 common shares. So if the debt is converted, the company will have to issue 10,000 new shares. In that case, the total number of shares will then become 700,000, and this is including the weighted average number of shares outstanding earlier used in the calculation of basic EPS. And if we do this, we get the diluted EPS equal to 1.07, which is 2 cents less than the basic EPS. When a company has stock options, warrants, or their equivalent outstanding, diluted EPS is calculated as if the financial instruments had been exercised and the company had used the proceeds from exercise to repurchase as many shares of common stock as possible at the average market price of the common stock during the period. The weighted average number of shares outstanding for diluted EPS is thus increased by the number of shares that would be issued upon exercise minus the number of shares that would have been purchased with the proceeds. This method is called the treasury method under the US GAAP because companies typically hold repurchased shares as treasury stock. The same method is used under IFRS, but it is not named. In the treasury stock method, the company is assumed to receive cash upon exercise and in exchange to issue shares. The company is assumed to use the cash proceeds to replace shares at the weighted average market price during the period. For calculating the diluted EPS, the incremental number of shares is the weighted average based upon the length of time the financial instrument was outstanding in the year. If the financial instrument was issued prior to the beginning of the year, the weighted average number of shares outstanding increases by the incremental number of shares. If the financial instruments were issued during the year, then the incremental shares are weighted by the amount of time the financial instruments were outstanding during the year. The assumed exercise of these financial instruments would not affect net income. For calculating EPS, therefore, no change is made to the numerator. In example 5, we are using the treasury stock method for stock options. Assume a company reported net income of $2.3 million for the year ended 30th June 2005 and has the following additional information. On average, the number of shares outstanding are 800,000. 30,000 options with an exercise price of $35 are outstanding. So those people who have these options, they can buy the share of the company for $35. No other potentially dilutive securities are outstanding. Over the year, its market price averaged $55 per share, which means that these options were in the money because the option holders had the right to buy the share for $35, which was selling in the market on average for $55 per share. Calculate the company's basic and diluted EPS. Now the formula for the basic EPS we already are aware of, and it will remain the same. However, the diluted EPS formula will change because this time we have the options and we are using the treasury stock method for the calculation of the diluted EPS. So net income minus preferred dividends divided by the weighted average number of shares outstanding plus new shares issued at option exercise minus the shares that could have been purchased with the cash received upon exercise. The treasury stock method here is assuming that the company will receive money from the options if they are exercised, that is $35 per share. The money received from the exercise of the option is used by the company to buy back its own shares from the market at a price of $55 per share. Of course, it will not be able to buy back 30,000 shares from the market to honor all the 30,000 options. So whatever number of share it is able to buy back from the market, it will not have to issue that but just buy it from the market and deliver it to the option holders. The remaining shares that it has to deliver to the option holders, it will issue them anew. So to calculate the number of shares to use in the denominator for diluted EPS when there are stock options outstanding under the treasury stock method, we start with the 800,000 shares that are already calculated as weighted average number of shares, and then there are 30,000 shares that are required to be issued in case the option holders exercise their options. However, it is assumed in the treasury stock method that if the options are exercised, it will result in a cash flow equal to 1.05 million to the company. That is 30,000 options converted at a price of $35 per share will result in 1.05 million cash. The treasury stock method then assumes that this cash flow is used by the company to buy back its own shares from the market at the average price of $55 per share, and with this amount in hand the company can buy 19,091 shares at this price from the market. So it has to give 30,000 shares to the option holders, and the money received from the option exercise is used to buy back 19,091 shares which are given to the option holders. The company has to literally issue only 10,909 new shares because the remaining 19,091 shares are bought back from the market using the proceeds from option exercise and are delivered to the option holders. So the total number of shares to be used in the denominator are 810,909. Here we see basic EPS is calculated as net income available to common shareholders because there is no preferred dividend, divided by the weighted average number of shares outstanding, that is 800,000, which is equal to $2.88 per share. The diluted EPS, on the other hand, again requires no adjustment in net income. However, the weighted average number of shares are now adjusted with the new shares to be issued in case the options are exercised and the treasury stock method is used. That is, only 10,909 new shares are expected to be issued in case the options are exercised given the treasury stock approach is used. The diluted EPS is equal to $2.84 per share, which shows a dilution of $0.04 from the basic EPS. So far we have seen the impact of dilutive securities on EPS. When they are included in the calculation of EPS, they result in lowering the EPS from the basic EPS level. The anti-dilutive securities, on the other hand, increases the EPS if they are included in the calculation of the EPS. Anti-dilutive securities are not included in the calculation of diluted EPS. Common size income statements show each line item on the income statement as a percentage of revenue or sales. Common size statements facilitate comparison across time periods, which is known as time series analysis, and also across companies, such as in this case we have company A, B, and C. This is known as cross-sectional analysis. The standardization of each line item removes the effect of size, and that makes comparison cross time and across companies very effective. The format shown here is distinguished as vertical common size analysis because every item in the income statement is represented as a percentage of the total sales vertically. However, as we move forward, we will come across horizontal common size analysis also later in the topics. The example presents here the partial income statements through operating profit for three hypothetical companies operating in the same industry. Company A and Company B, each with 10 million in sales, are larger as measured by sales than Company C, which has only 2 million in sales. In addition, companies A and B both have higher operating profit of $2 million and $1.5 million respectively, compared with Company C's operating profit of only $400,000. How can an analyst meaningfully compare the performance of these companies given their size differences? Common size statements such as the one shown here facilitate comparison. From these, we can observe that compared with Company A, company C's expenses and profit as a percentage of its sales are identical. Compared with company B, although company C's operating profit is lower than company B's in absolute dollars, it is higher in percentage terms, 20% for company C compared with only 15% for company B. For each $100 of sale, company C generates $5 more operating profit than company B. In other words, company C is relatively more profitable than company B based on this measure. The common size income statement also highlights differences in companies' strategies. Comparing the two larger companies, company A and company B, we see that company A reports significantly higher gross profit as a percentage of sales than does company B, 70% compared with 25% gross profit margin for A and B respectively. Given that both companies operate in the same industry, why can company A generate so much higher gross profit? One possible explanation is found by comparing the operating expenses of the two companies. Company A spends significantly more on R&D and on advertising than company B. Expenditures on R&D likely results in products with superior technology. Expenditures on advertising likely results in greater brand awareness. So based on these differences, it is likely that company A is selling technologically superior product with a better brand image. Company B may be selling its product more cheaply with a lower gross profit as a percentage of sales, but saving money by not investing in R&D or advertising. In practice, differences across companies are more subtle, but the concept is similar. As an analyst, noting these significant differences, you would do more research and seek to understand the underlying reasons for the differences and their implications for the future performance of the companies. An important aspect of financial performance is profitability. One indicator of profitability is net profit margin, which is also known as profit margin, and return on sale as well. It is calculated as the net income divided by the revenue or sales of the business. In the definition of margin ratios of this type, sales is often used interchangeably with revenue. Return on sales has also been used to refer to a class of profitability ratios having revenue in the denominator. So, return on sales should not be confused with net profit margin always. There may be other ratios that may be referred to as return on sales, such as gross profit or operating profit on sales. Net profit margin is equal to net income divided by revenue. Net profit margin measures the amount of income that a company was able to generate for each dollar of revenue. Higher level of net profit margin indicates higher profitability and hence higher profit margins are desirable. Net profit margin can also be found directly from the common size income statement as net income is divided by revenue as a line item and shown on the common size income statement. Another measure of profitability is the gross profit margin, which is equal to gross profit divided by the revenue or sales of the company. Gross profit margin measures the amount of gross profit that a company generated for each dollar of revenue. Higher level of gross profit margin indicates higher profitability and thus is generally more desirable, although differences in gross profit margin across companies reflect differences in company strategies as we discussed earlier. Other measures of profitability include operating profit margin, which is operating income divided by revenue or sales, and the pre-tax margin, which is earning before taxes divided by revenue. All these measures are indicating profitability. The higher are these measures, the better it is for a company. These are income statement ratios because both the numerator and the denominator are from the income statement, and that is the reason we see them on the common size income statement and call them income statement ratios. So, income statement ratios are those ratios where the numerator and the denominator both come from income statement. In addition to profitability ratios, there may be different expense ratios that can be calculated from the income statement.